The neon sign flickered against the storm-dark sky, casting sickly pink shadows across the cracked asphalt. The Pines Motel, vacancy, it read, though half the letters had died years ago, leaving only PNSMTL, VCNCY, to greet the desperate traveler. Marcus pulled his sedan into the empty parking lot, windshield wipers struggling against the relentless downpour. The GPS had died 20 miles back, along with his cell signal, leaving him stranded on this forgotten stretch of highway. The fuel gauge hovered dangerously close to empty, and exhaustion weighed heavy on his eyelids after 16 hours of driving. The motel squatted before him like a wounded animal, its pale green paint peeling in leprous patches. Most of the windows were dark, but a few glowed with the sickly yellow light of old incandescent bulbs. The office sat at the far end, its door hanging slightly ajar despite the storm. Marcus grabbed his overnight bag and sprinted through the rain, his footsteps echoing hollowly on the wooden walkway that connected the rooms. The door chimes jangled as he pushed into the office, a sound like broken bones rattling in a box. The clerk looked up from behind the counter, his face gaunt and pale in the fluorescent light. Deep shadows pooled beneath his eyes, and his smile revealed teeth the color of old ivory. "Welcome to the Pines," he said, his voice carrying the weight of years. "Terrible night to be on the road." "I need a room," Marcus said, shaking rain from his jacket. "Just for the night." The clerk's smile widened, though it never reached his eyes. "Of course. We have plenty of vacancies." He turned the guest book toward Marcus, the pages yellowed and brittle. "Just sign here." Marcus scrawled his name and noticed the entries above his own. The dates made his stomach clench, most were from weeks, even months ago. The handwriting grew increasingly erratic as he read backward through time, some entries barely legible, others ending in what looked like dark stains. "Room 13, the clerk said, sliding a tarnished key across the counter. "That'll be $40. Marcus paid in cash, eager to escape the clerk's unsettling stare. "Is there anywhere to eat around here?" "Kitchen closed years ago," the clerk replied. "But there's a vending machine outside room 7. Sometimes it works." The key felt ice-cold in Marcus's palm as he ventured back into the storm. Room 13 sat near the center of the complex, its door painted the same sickly green as the building's exterior. The key turned reluctantly, as if the lock hadn't been used in years. The room reeked of mildew and something else, something sweet and cloying that made Marcus's nose wrinkle. The carpet was worn thin, stained with decades of spills and secrets. A single bed dominated the space, its floral bedspread faded to the color of old bone. The television was an ancient CRT model with rabbit ears, and the air conditioning unit rattled like a dying man's breath. Marcus set his bag on the dresser and noticed the mirror above it was cracked, creating a spider web of fractures that distorted his reflection into a dozen broken pieces. He turned away, unsettled by the sight of his own fragmented face. The bathroom was worse. Brown water stains streaked the walls, and the shower curtain hung in tatters. But it was the bathtub that made him pause. Dark stains ringed the porcelain, stains that looked suspiciously like dried blood. Thunder crashed overhead, rattling the windows. Marcus decided against a shower and returned to the bedroom, where he noticed something he'd missed before. The walls were covered with photographs, old Polaroids and faded snapshots showing the motel in its heyday. Families posed beside vintage cars, children played in what must have been a swimming pool, couples smiled beneath the intact neon sign. But as Marcus looked closer, he saw something wrong in every image. Shadows that didn't match their owners. Faces in windows that shouldn't have been there. And in the background of each photograph, barely visible, stood a figure in a dark coat, watching. The electricity flickered, plunging the room into darkness for a heartbeat before the lights returned. When they did, Marcus could have sworn one of the photographs had changed. The figure in the dark coat was closer now, more distinct. He turned on the television, desperate for distraction. Static filled the screen, occasionally resolving into fragments of old programs, a game show from the 1970s, a soap opera from the 1980s, a news broadcast about a string of disappearances along this very highway. The anchor's voice was distorted, warped by time and decay. Police continue to search for the missing travelers, but authorities fear the worst. Marcus quickly shut off the TV, but the silence that followed was worse than the static. He could hear something moving in the walls, not mice or insects, but something larger, something that seemed to be keeping pace with his heartbeat. A knock at the door made him jump. 3 slow, deliberate raps. "Who is it?" he called, but received no answer. The knocking came again, more insistent this time. Marcus approached the door cautiously and peered through the peephole. The walkway outside was empty, but the door to room 12 stood open, revealing nothing but darkness beyond. He opened his own door a crack and felt the cold night air rush in. The storm had intensified, and the wind howled through the eaves like a choir of the damned. But there was something else, a sound like whispers, just beneath the threshold of hearing. Room 12's door creaked wider, and Marcus glimpsed movement in the shadows. Someone was in there, standing just beyond the reach of the light. The figure was tall and thin, wearing what looked like a dark coat. "Hello?" Marcus called, but the figure didn't respond. Instead, it began to move, not walking, but gliding across the floor toward the doorway. Marcus slammed his door shut and threw the deadbolt, his heart hammering against his ribs. The whispers grew louder, more urgent, and now he could make out words: "Join us, stay with us, you can never leave." The lights flickered again, and this time they stayed off. The darkness was absolute, suffocating. Marcus fumbled for his phone, but it remained dead, the screen black and unresponsive. He groped along the wall until he found the light switch, flipping it frantically, but nothing happened. Something scraped against the door, fingernails on wood, long and deliberate. The scratching moved down the length of the door, then stopped. The silence that followed was pregnant with menace. Marcus pressed his back against the far wall, trying to steady his breathing. The air had grown thick and oppressive, like being underwater. The sweet, cloying smell from earlier was stronger now, and he realized with growing horror what it was: the smell of decay, of death. A new sound reached his ears, the squeal of rusty hinges. But his door was still closed, still locked. The sound was coming from inside the room. A pale light began to emanate from the bathroom, casting long shadows across the bedroom floor. Marcus watched in terror as the shadows began to move, writhing and twisting like living things. They crept across the carpet toward him, and wherever they touched, the temperature dropped. The bathroom door, which he was certain he'd left open, was now closed. But light leaked around its edges, and from behind it came the sound of running water, not the clean flow of a faucet, but something thick and viscous. The door opened with agonizing slowness, revealing the bathroom beyond. The tub was full now, brimming with dark liquid that reflected the pale light like black glass. And standing beside it, finally visible in the ghostly illumination, was the figure from the photographs. It was tall and gaunt, its face hidden beneath the brim of a wide hat. Its coat hung in tatters, revealing glimpses of what lay beneath, not flesh, but something far worse. Its hands were pale and skeletal, ending in fingernails that had grown long and yellow with age. "Welcome," it said, its voice like autumn leaves scraping across stone. "We've been waiting for you." More figures began to emerge from the shadows, previous guests, Marcus realized with mounting terror. They moved with the jerky, unnatural gait of marionettes, their faces slack and their eyes reflecting nothing but emptiness. Some wore clothes from decades past, others were dressed in more recent attire, but all bore the same expression of resigned despair. "The register," the figure in the coat continued. "You signed the register. That makes you part of the Pines family now." Marcus tried to run, but his legs wouldn't obey. The shadows had reached him, wrapping around his ankles like chains. He could feel them pulling him forward, toward the bathroom, toward the dark liquid in the tub. "Don't fight it," whispered a woman in a 1960s dress, her voice hollow and distant. "It's easier if you don't fight." The liquid in the tub began to bubble and churn, and Marcus saw faces floating just beneath the surface, the faces of everyone who had ever signed the register, everyone who had ever sought shelter at the Pines Motel. He opened his mouth to scream, but no sound came. The shadows had reached his throat now, cold and suffocating. The last thing he saw before the darkness claimed him was the figure in the coat reaching out with one skeletal hand, beckoning him home. The next morning, the storm had passed, leaving the highway clean and bright under the morning sun. A state trooper making his rounds noticed the abandoned sedan in the motel parking lot and decided to investigate. He found the office empty, coated in dust as if it hadn't been occupied in years. The guest register lay open on the counter, its pages blank except for a few faded entries from decades past. The most recent signature was barely legible, written in what looked like rust-colored ink, Marcus Chen, October 15th. The trooper checked the rooms, but found them all empty and locked. Room 13 showed no signs of recent occupancy, though he noticed the mirror above the dresser was cracked, and the photographs on the walls seemed to watch him as he searched. He filed his report and arranged for the car to be towed, but the case was quickly forgotten. Just another traveler who'd stopped at the wrong place, at the wrong time. The highway swallowed such stories regularly, and the state had bigger problems to worry about. But sometimes, on stormy nights when the wind howls through the pines, drivers report seeing a pale green motel by the side of the road. They see the flickering neon sign, the promise of shelter from the storm. And some of them, the desperate ones, the ones who have no choice, pull into that empty parking lot and walk through that office door. The clerk is always waiting, his smile wide and welcoming. The register is always ready for another signature. And room 13 is always available, no matter how many guests have checked in before. The Pines Motel has plenty of vacancies. There's always room for one more. The heat shimmered off the asphalt in waves, creating phantom lakes that dissolved as Sarah's car approached. She'd been driving for 8 hours straight through the Nevada desert, her air conditioning failing 50 miles back, leaving her windows down and her dark hair whipping in the scorching wind. The GPS had lost signal an hour ago, and her phone showed no bars, just endless desert and the ribbon of cracked highway stretching toward the horizon. When she saw the motel sign rising from the heat haze like a mirage, Sarah almost didn't trust her eyes. Desert Rose Motel, it read in faded pink cursive, topped with a neon rose that flickered weakly in the blazing afternoon sun. The building itself was a long, low structure of sun-bleached stucco, its walls the color of old bones. A few skeletal palm trees stood guard around a drained swimming pool, their fronds brown and brittle as paper. Sarah pulled into the parking lot, her tires crunching on gravel mixed with broken glass. Only one other vehicle sat in the lot, a rusted pickup truck that looked like it hadn't moved in months. The silence was absolute except for the tick of her cooling engine and the distant whisper of wind through the desert. The office door stood propped open by a chunk of concrete, and Sarah could see the flicker of fluorescent lights inside. A bell chimed as she stepped through the doorway, the sound sharp and metallic in the stifling air. The interior was a time capsule from the 1970s, wood paneling, orange shag carpet, and a reception desk that might have been fashionable 40 years ago. "Help you?" The voice came from behind the desk, and Sarah jumped. She hadn't seen anyone when she entered. A woman emerged from the shadows, elderly and thin, with silver hair pulled back in a tight bun. Her eyes were pale blue, almost colorless, and they studied Sarah with uncomfortable intensity. "I need a room," Sarah said, suddenly aware of how her voice echoed in the empty space. "Just for the night." The woman's lips curved in what might have been a smile. "Of course, dear. We don't get many visitors anymore." She pulled out a leather-bound guest book, its pages yellowed with age. "Sign here, please." Sarah scrawled her name, noting that the previous entries were sparse and dated weeks apart. The handwriting above hers was shaky, uncertain, as if written by someone whose hands were trembling. "Room 7, the woman said, sliding a tarnished key across the desk. That'll be $35. Sarah paid in cash, eager to escape the woman's unsettling stare. Is there anywhere to eat around here? Vending machine by the pool, the woman replied. Sometimes it works. Sometimes it doesn't. Her laugh was dry as desert wind. My name's Ethel, by the way. I've been running this place for, longer than you've been alive, I'd guess. Room 7 was located halfway down the motel's single corridor, its door painted the same faded pink as the sign. The key turned easily, and Sarah stepped into a room that smelled of dust and something else, something sweet and medicinal that reminded her of hospitals. The furniture was vintage 1970s, a queen bed with a floral spread, a round table with 2 chairs, and a console television that belonged in a museum. But it was clean, cleaner than she'd expected, and the air conditioning unit hummed quietly in the corner. Sarah set her bag on the bed and noticed the walls were covered with photographs, dozens of them, all showing the motel in its heyday. She studied the images with growing unease. They showed families posing by the pool, couples holding hands beneath the neon sign, children playing in the courtyard. But something was wrong with every photograph. The colors were too bright, the smiles too wide, and the eyes of the subjects seemed to follow her as she moved around the room. In one photo, a family of 4 stood beside a station wagon, their faces beaming with happiness. But when Sarah looked closer, she saw that their shadows were all wrong, twisted and elongated, reaching toward something outside the frame. In another, a young couple embraced beneath the Desert Rose sign, but their reflection in the office window showed something entirely different, 2 figures locked in what looked like a violent struggle. The bathroom was small but functional, with pink tiles and a shower that actually produced hot water. Sarah decided to clean up before exploring further, but as she undressed, she caught sight of herself in the mirror above the sink. For just a moment, her reflection seemed to lag behind her movements, as if the image was struggling to keep up with reality. She showered quickly, unnerved by the way the water swirled down the drain, not in the usual clockwise spiral, but in strange, angular patterns that hurt to look at. When she emerged, the bathroom was full of steam, and someone had written a message on the mirror. Don't trust the photographs. Sarah's blood ran cold. The message was written in what looked like condensation, but the bathroom door was locked, and she'd been alone the entire time. She wiped the mirror clean, but the words reappeared immediately, as if written by an invisible hand. She dressed hurriedly and returned to the main room, where she noticed something that made her stomach clench. The photographs on the walls had changed. The subjects were in different positions, their expressions subtly altered. The family by the station wagon was no longer smiling, their faces were frozen in expressions of terror. The young couple beneath the sign was gone entirely, replaced by an empty frame. A knock at the door made her jump. 3 slow, deliberate raps. Who is it? She called, but received no answer. The knocking came again, more insistent. Sarah approached the door cautiously and peered through the peephole. The corridor outside was empty, but she could see that the door to room 8 stood slightly ajar, revealing nothing but darkness beyond. She opened her own door a crack and felt the desert heat wash over her. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of red and orange that reminded her of blood. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the distant hum of the air conditioning and something else, a sound like whispers, just at the edge of hearing. Hello, she called, but the words seemed to die in the still air. The door to room 8 creaked open wider, and Sarah glimpsed movement in the shadows. Someone was in there, standing just beyond the reach of the light. The figure was tall and thin, wearing what looked like a white dress or gown. Are you okay? Sarah asked, stepping partway into the corridor. The figure didn't respond, but it began to move, not walking, but gliding across the floor toward the doorway. As it drew closer, Sarah could see that it was a woman, elderly and gaunt, with long white hair that hung in tangles around her face. Her skin was pale as moonlight, and her eyes were the same colorless blue as Ethel's. Help me, the woman whispered, her voice like wine through dry leaves. I can't find my way out. Sarah backed toward her own door, instinctively sensing danger. What do you mean? The exit is right there. The woman's head tilted at an unnatural angle, and her smile revealed teeth that were too sharp, too long. There is no exit, she said. Not for any of us. We're all part of the collection now. Sarah slammed her door shut and threw the deadbolt, her heart pounding. The corridor outside had gone completely silent, as if the entire motel was holding its breath. She pressed her ear to the door but heard nothing, no footsteps, no voices, nothing but the oppressive weight of silence. She turned back to the room and gasped. The photographs on the walls were moving now, their subjects turning to look at her with expressions of desperate pleading. The family by the station wagon was gesturing frantically, their mouths open in silent screams. The young couple had returned, but now they were reaching toward the camera, their faces etched with terror. And in every photograph, standing in the background like a recurring nightmare, was the pale woman from room 8. In some images she was distant, barely visible. In others she was closer, her colorless eyes fixed on the camera with predatory intent. The air in the room grew thick and stifling, despite the air conditioning. Sarah could taste something metallic on her tongue, and the sweet, medicinal smell was stronger now. She realized with growing horror that it was the smell of embalming fluid. A new sound reached her ears, the creak of old wood, as if the building itself was settling. But the sound was rhythmic, purposeful, like footsteps on a wooden floor. They seemed to be coming from above, from the ceiling, moving back and forth in a steady pattern. Sarah looked up and saw a dark stain spreading across the ceiling tiles, seeping through in slow, viscous drops. The liquid was dark red, almost black, and where it hit the carpet, it sizzled like acid. The photographs on the walls began to change more rapidly now, their subjects moving and gesturing with increasing urgency. They were trying to tell her something, Sarah realized, trying to warn her. But warn her of what? The answer came as the lights flickered and went out, plunging the room into absolute darkness. In the suffocating blackness, Sarah heard the door to her room open, not her door, but the door in one of the photographs. She could hear the subjects climbing out of their frames, their feet hitting the floor with wet, squishy sounds. Join us, they whispered in unison, their voices layered and distorted. Stay with us forever. Be part of the collection. Sarah fumbled for her phone, but it was dead, the screen black and unresponsive. She groped along the wall until she found the light switch, but flipping it did nothing. The darkness was absolute, suffocating. Something cold and wet touched her ankle, and she screamed. The sound echoed strangely, as if the room had suddenly become much larger than it should be. She could hear them moving around her now, dozens of them, maybe hundreds, all the guests who had ever stayed at the Desert Rose Motel. Please, she whispered, but her voice was lost in the chorus of the dead. A pale light began to emanate from the photographs, casting eerie shadows across the room. In the ghostly illumination, Sarah saw them clearly, the subjects from the pictures, no longer confined to their frames. They moved with the jerky, unnatural gait of marionettes, their faces slack and their eyes reflecting nothing but emptiness. And leading them was the pale woman from room 8, her white dress flowing around her like smoke. In the dim light, Sarah could see her true nature, not a woman at all, but something that had worn human form so long it had forgotten how to shed it. Welcome to the Desert Rose, the creature said, its voice like the whisper of sand across stone. We've been waiting for you. Sarah tried to run, but her legs wouldn't obey. The darkness had taken root in her bones, spreading through her body like ice water. She could feel herself changing, becoming part of the collection, another subject for the photographs. The last thing she saw before the darkness claimed her was her own reflection in the window, but it wasn't her reflection anymore. It was a photograph, frozen in time, showing her standing in room 7 with the same expression of desperate terror she'd seen on all the others. The next morning, a highway patrol officer making his rounds noticed the abandoned car in the motel parking lot. He found the office empty, coated in dust as if it hadn't been occupied in years. The guest book lay open on the counter, its pages blank except for a few faded entries from decades past. He checked the rooms, but found them all empty and locked. Room 7 showed no signs of recent occupancy, though he noticed the photographs on the walls seemed to watch him as he searched. In one of them, he thought he glimpsed a dark-haired woman standing beside a bed, her mouth open in a silent scream. But when he looked again, the frame was empty. The officer filed his report and arranged for the car to be towed. Just another traveler who'd stopped at the wrong place, at the wrong time. The desert was full of such stories, and the state had bigger problems to worry about. But sometimes, when the heat rises off the asphalt in shimmering waves, drivers report seeing a sun-bleached motel by the side of the road. They see the flickering neon rose, the promise of shelter from the scorching sun. And some of them, the desperate ones, the ones who have no choice, pull into that gravel parking lot and walk through that office door. Ethel is always waiting, her smile wide and welcoming. The guest book is always ready for another signature. And room 7 is always available, no matter how many guests have checked in before. The fog rolled in from the Pacific like a living thing, swallowing the coastal highway in tendrils of gray that seemed to pulse with their own heartbeat. Detective Elena Vasquez squinted through the windshield as her headlights carved weak paths through the murk, revealing glimpses of guardrails and cliff faces before the mist closed in again. She'd been driving for 3 hours since leaving San Francisco, following a lead that had gone cold weeks ago. 3 missing persons, all last seen along this stretch of Highway 1. The trail had led her to a small coastal town called Perdition Bay, where the locals claimed they'd never heard of any missing tourists. But Elena had learned to read between the lines of small-town silence. The motel materialized out of the fog like a ghost ship, its neon sign casting an eerie blue glow through the mist. Moonlight Motor Lodge, color TV, pool, vacancy, it proclaimed in letters that flickered and buzzed with electrical malfunction. The building itself was a horseshoe-shaped structure of weathered wood and peeling paint, its windows dark except for the office at the far end. Elena pulled into the empty parking lot, her engine the only sound in the absolute silence. The fog was so thick she could barely see the ocean beyond the cliff, though she could hear the waves crashing against the rocks below. The air smelled of salt and something else, something organic and unpleasant that made her nose wrinkle. The office door chimed as she entered, the sound muffled by the fog that seemed to have followed her inside. The interior was stuck in the 1960s, knotty pine walls, a stone fireplace, and furniture that belonged in a hunting lodge. Behind the desk sat a man in his 60s, his face weathered by years of coastal wind and sun. His eyes were the color of sea glass, and they studied Elena with the wariness of someone who'd seen too much. "Evening," he said, his voice gravelly. "Looking for a room?" Elena flashed her badge. "Detective Vasquez, SFPD. I'm investigating some disappearances. 3 tourists, all last seen along this stretch of highway over the past month." The man's expression didn't change. "Name's Henry Gull. I own this place. Can't say I recall any tourists matching that description." "I haven't described them yet," Elena pointed out. Henry's smile was thin as a knife blade. "Don't get many tourists anymore. Highway's too dangerous, especially in the fog. People lose their way, drive right off the cliff. Happens more often than you'd think." Elena studied the guest register on the counter. The most recent entries were dated weeks apart, and she noticed that several names had been crossed out with heavy black ink. "Mind if I take a look around?" "Need a warrant for that," Henry said. "But you're welcome to rent a room. Might not be safe driving in this fog." As if summoned by his words, the fog pressed against the windows, thick and impenetrable. Elena realized she couldn't even see her car in the parking lot anymore. The idea of navigating the winding coastal highway in these conditions was genuinely dangerous. "Fine," she said. "One night. Henry handed her a key marked Room 9 and took her credit card. Checkout's at 11. Try not to wander around too much after dark. The fog plays tricks on people. Room 9 was located in the center of the horseshoe, its door painted navy blue like all the others. The key turned easily, and Elena stepped into a room that smelled of pine cleaner and something underneath, something sweet and rotten that reminded her of flowers left too long in a vase. The decor was vintage 1960s, a queen bed with a geometric bedspread, a round table with 2 chairs, and a console television that looked like it weighed 200 pounds. But it was clean and functional, and the heater worked when she turned it on. Elena set her overnight bag on the bed and noticed the walls were covered with maritime photographs, ships in storms, lighthouses on rocky coasts, and seascapes that seemed to move when she wasn't looking directly at them. She tried her cell phone, but there was no signal. The landline in the room produced only static when she lifted the receiver. Elena was effectively cut off from the outside world, trapped in this pocket of fog and isolation. The bathroom was small but clean, with blue tiles and a shower that actually produced hot water. But as Elena prepared to wash up, she noticed something odd about the mirror above the sink. The reflection showed the bathroom correctly, but there was something wrong with the proportions. The room looked deeper than it should, as if the mirror were showing a space that extended far beyond the actual walls. She leaned closer and gasped. In the depths of the reflection, she could see another bathroom, identical to hers but occupied by a figure hunched over the sink. The figure was female, with long dark hair that obscured her face. She was wearing a white dress that might have been fashionable in the 1960s. Elena spun around, but the bathroom behind her was empty. When she looked back at the mirror, the figure was gone, leaving only her own reflection staring back with wide, frightened eyes. She decided to skip the shower and return to the bedroom, where she noticed that the maritime photographs seemed different somehow. The ships were in slightly different positions, the waves had changed their patterns, and the lighthouses cast their beams in new directions. But when she tried to focus on any specific change, it slipped away like water through her fingers. A knock at the door made her jump. 3 slow, deliberate raps that seemed to echo through the fog-muffled night. "Who is it?" she called, hand instinctively moving to her service weapon. No answer. The knocking came again, more insistent. Elena approached the door cautiously and peered through the peephole. The walkway outside was empty, but she could see that the door to room 8 stood slightly ajar, revealing darkness beyond. The fog had grown thicker, swirling around the building like a living thing. She opened her own door a crack and felt the damp, cold air rush in. The smell was stronger now, not just salt and decay, but something else. Something that reminded her of old bones and deep water. "Hello?" she called, but her voice was swallowed by the fog. The door to room 8 creaked open wider, and Elena glimpsed movement in the shadows. Someone was in there, standing just beyond the reach of the light. The figure was tall and thin, wearing what looked like a white dress. "Are you okay?" Elena asked, stepping partway into the corridor. The figure didn't respond, but it began to move, not walking, but gliding across the floor toward the doorway. As it drew closer, Elena could see that it was a woman, young and pale, with long dark hair that hung in wet tangles around her face. Her skin had a bluish tint, and her eyes were the color of deep water. "Help me," the woman whispered, her voice like waves on shingle. "I can't find my way back to the surface." Elena's training kicked in, but something primitive in her brain was screaming warnings. "Back to the surface? What do you mean?" The woman's head tilted at an unnatural angle, and Elena saw that her neck was bent in a way that suggested it had been broken. "The water," she said. "It's so cold down there. So dark. We're all waiting for someone to find us." Elena backed toward her own door, hand on her weapon. "Who's waiting? What are you talking about?" The woman's smile revealed teeth that were too sharp, too many. "The guests," she said. "All the guests who checked in but never checked out. We're all down there, at the bottom of the sea, waiting for someone to join us. Elena slammed her door shut and threw the deadbolt, her heart pounding. The corridor outside had gone completely silent, as if the entire motel was holding its breath. She pressed her ear to the door but heard nothing, no footsteps, no voices, nothing but the oppressive weight of silence. She turned back to the room and gasped. The maritime photographs on the walls were moving now, their subjects turning to look at her with expressions of desperate pleading. The ships were sinking, their crews reaching toward the camera with outstretched hands. The lighthouses were dark, their beams extinguished. And in every photograph, standing in the background like a recurring nightmare, was the pale woman from room 8. The air in the room grew thick and damp, despite the heater. Elena could taste salt on her tongue, and the sweet, rotten smell was stronger now. She realized with growing horror that it was the smell of the sea, of things that had been underwater too long. A new sound reached her ears, the distant crash of waves, but not from outside. The sound was coming from within the walls themselves, as if the ocean was rising around the motel. The floor beneath her feet felt wet, and when she looked down, she saw dark water seeping through the cracks in the floorboards. Elena looked up and saw a dark stain spreading across the ceiling, seeping through in slow, viscous drops. The liquid was dark and briny, and where it hit the carpet, it left stains that looked like sea foam. The photographs on the walls began to change more rapidly now, their subjects moving and gesturing with increasing urgency. They were trying to tell her something, Elena realized, trying to warn her. But warn her of what? The answer came as the lights flickered and went out, plunging the room into absolute darkness. In the suffocating blackness, Elena heard the sound of water rushing in, not from outside, but from the photographs themselves. She could hear the subjects climbing out of their frames, their feet hitting the floor with wet, sloshy sounds. "Join us," they whispered in unison, their voices layered and distorted like sounds heard underwater. "Come down to the deep with us. Be part of the collection at the bottom of the sea." Elena fumbled for her phone, but it was dead, the screen black and unresponsive. She groped along the wall until she found the light switch, but flipping it did nothing. The darkness was absolute, suffocating, like being underwater. Something cold and wet wrapped around her ankle, and she screamed. The sound echoed strangely, as if the room had suddenly become much larger than it should be. She could hear them moving around her now, dozens of them, maybe hundreds, all the guests who had ever stayed at the Moonlight Motor Lodge. "Please," she whispered, but her voice was lost in the chorus of the drowned. A pale light began to emanate from the photographs, casting eerie shadows across the room. In the ghostly illumination, Elena saw them clearly, the subjects from the pictures, no longer confined to their frames. They moved with the fluid grace of things that had learned to live underwater, their faces slack and their eyes reflecting nothing but the depths. And leading them was the pale woman from room 8, her white dress flowing around her like seaweed. In the dim light, Elena could see her true nature, not a woman at all, but something that had once been human, transformed by years beneath the waves. "Welcome to the Moonlight Motor Lodge," the creature said, its voice like the whisper of tide pools. "We've been waiting for you to join our collection." Elena tried to run, but her legs wouldn't obey. The water had risen to her knees now, cold and dark and full of things that brushed against her skin. She could feel herself changing, becoming part of the collection, another subject for the photographs. The last thing she saw before the darkness claimed her was her own reflection in the window, but it wasn't her reflection anymore. It was a photograph, frozen in time, showing her standing in room 9 with the same expression of desperate terror she'd seen on all the others, water streaming from her hair and clothes as if she'd just been pulled from the sea. The next morning, the fog lifted to reveal clear skies and calm seas. A highway patrol officer making his rounds noticed the abandoned police car in the motel parking lot and decided to investigate. He found the office empty, coated in dust as if it hadn't been occupied in years. The guest book lay open on the counter, its pages blank except for a few faded entries from decades past. He checked the rooms, but found them all empty and locked. Room 9 showed no signs of recent occupancy, though he noticed the maritime photographs on the walls seemed to watch him as he searched. In one of them, he thought he glimpsed a dark-haired woman in a police uniform standing beside a bed, her mouth open in a silent scream. But when he looked again, the frame showed only empty ocean. The officer filed his report and arranged for the car to be towed. Just another case of someone who'd driven off the cliff in the fog, probably. The coastal highway claimed lives regularly, and the county had bigger problems to worry about. But sometimes, when the fog rolls in from the Pacific like a living thing, drivers report seeing a weathered motel by the side of the road. They see the flickering blue neon, the promise of shelter from the treacherous highway. And some of them, the desperate ones, the ones who have no choice, pull into that empty parking lot and walk through that office door. Henry is always waiting, his smile thin as a knife blade. The guest book is always ready for another signature. And room 9 is always available, no matter how many guests have checked in before. The Moonlight Motor Lodge has plenty of vacancies. There's always room for one more in the collection at the bottom of the sea. The thunderstorm had been following Danny Morrison for the last 100 miles, its lightning illuminating the twisted trees that lined the mountain highway like arthritic fingers. Rain hammered his windshield with increasing fury, and the wipers struggled to keep up with the deluge. He'd been driving for 12 hours straight, fleeing a life that had fallen apart in spectacular fashion, lost job, failed marriage, eviction notice sitting on his kitchen table. When the headlights caught the wooden sign emerging from the darkness, Danny nearly missed it entirely. Starlight Inn, established 1952, cabins available, it read in faded paint, an arrow pointing down a narrow dirt road that disappeared into the pine forest. Danny hesitated for a moment, then turned off the highway. Anything was better than driving blind through this storm. The road wound through dense woods for nearly a mile before opening into a clearing where a cluster of log cabins surrounded a larger building that must have been the main lodge. Warm yellow light spilled from the windows, and smoke curled from several chimneys despite the summer season. Danny parked near the main building and made a dash for the entrance, his sneakers splashing through puddles that reflected the lightning above. The lobby was a monument to rustic charm, rough-hewn logs, a massive stone fireplace, and mounted deer heads that seemed to watch him with glass eyes. The air smelled of wood smoke and something else, something earthy and organic that reminded him of autumn leaves. Behind a desk carved from a single piece of pine sat a man in his 50s, his face tanned and weathered like old leather. "Welcome to the Starlight Inn," the man said, his voice carrying a slight Appalachian accent. "I'm Frank Holloway, the owner. Terrible night to be on the road." "Danny Morrison," he replied, shaking rain from his jacket. "I need a room for the night. Maybe longer, if you have availability." Frank's smile was genuinely warm. "Of course. We don't get many guests anymore, especially not in weather like this." He turned a leather-bound register toward Danny. "Just sign here, and I'll get you set up in cabin 6. It's one of our nicest, right by the creek." Danny scrawled his name and noticed the guest book was surprisingly full. Names and dates going back weeks, even months. The handwriting was neat and careful, as if each guest had taken their time with the entry. But something about the signatures nagged at him, they all looked somehow similar, as if written by the same hand. "That'll be $40, Frank said, sliding a heavy iron key across the desk. "Breakfast is at 7 in the main dining room." "And Danny? Try not to wander around too much after dark. The woods can be dangerous at night." Cabin 6 was a cozy single-room structure with a stone fireplace, a comfortable bed, and knotty pine walls decorated with vintage photographs of the inn's heyday. Danny built a fire to chase away the mountain chill and settled in for the night. The storm continued to rage outside, but the cabin felt safe and warm. He was drifting off to sleep when he heard it, a soft scratching sound coming from the walls. At first he thought it might be mice or squirrels, but the scratching was too rhythmic, too purposeful. It sounded almost like someone writing, the scratch of a pen on paper. Danny sat up and listened more carefully. The sound was coming from the wall behind the headboard, long deliberate strokes followed by shorter ones. As he focused on the pattern, he realized with growing unease that it sounded like someone forming letters, spelling out words in the darkness. He climbed out of bed and pressed his ear to the wall. The scratching stopped immediately, as if whoever was on the other side had sensed his presence. Danny waited, barely breathing, but the sound didn't resume. In the morning, the storm had passed, leaving the forest clean and bright under the morning sun. Danny felt foolish about his fears from the night before. Old buildings made strange noises, especially in storms. He dressed and headed to the main lodge for breakfast. The dining room was empty except for Frank, who was setting plates on a long wooden table. "Sleep well?" he asked. "Mostly," Danny replied. "Though I thought I heard something in the walls. Probably just the storm." Frank's expression flickered for just a moment. "Oh, that. Yeah, the cabins are old. They settle and creak, especially in bad weather. Nothing to worry about." Breakfast was excellent, fresh eggs, bacon, and coffee that tasted like it had been roasted yesterday. Danny found himself relaxing for the first time in weeks. Maybe he'd stay a few more days, clear his head, figure out what to do next. "I might extend my stay," he mentioned to Frank. "If that's possible." "Of course," Frank said, his smile returning. "Stay as long as you like. We enjoy having guests." Danny spent the day exploring the grounds, walking the nature trails that wound through the pine forest. The inn was beautiful in daylight, well-maintained cabins, a crystal-clear creek, and mountain views that took his breath away. But as the sun began to set, he noticed something odd about the other cabins. They all showed signs of recent occupancy, lights in windows, smoke from chimneys, cars parked outside. But he hadn't seen any other guests at breakfast, and the dining room had been empty all day. When he asked Frank about it, the older man just shrugged. "Some folks prefer to keep to themselves," he said. "Mountain people value their privacy." That night, the scratching returned, louder and more insistent than before. Danny got up and examined the wall more carefully, running his hands over the rough logs. Behind the headboard, he found something that made his blood run cold, words carved into the wood, so faint they were barely visible unless you knew where to look. "Help me," the first message read, carved in shaky letters. Below it, another message, "Trapped here." And below that, "Can't leave." Danny's hands shook as he traced the carved letters. Someone had been imprisoned in this cabin, desperate enough to carve messages into the walls. But who? And when? He was about to investigate further when he heard footsteps outside his cabin. Slow, deliberate steps that seemed to circle the building. Danny peered out the window but saw nothing in the darkness beyond the circle of light from his porch lamp. The footsteps stopped directly outside his door. Danny held his breath, waiting for a knock that never came. Instead, he heard a new sound, the soft scratch of something being written on paper. It was coming from just outside his door, as if someone was writing on the wooden surface. Danny waited until the sound stopped, then carefully opened the door. The porch was empty, but there, carved into the wood of the door itself, was a fresh message, "You're next." The letters were deep and precise, as if carved with a sharp knife. But they hadn't been there when Danny arrived. Someone had carved them while he was inside, and he hadn't heard the sound of cutting wood, only the soft scratch of writing. Danny packed his bag immediately and headed for the main lodge. He found Frank in the lobby, sitting by the fireplace as if he'd been waiting. "Leaving us so soon?" Frank asked, his tone disappointed but not surprised. "I found messages carved in my cabin," Danny said. "Someone was asking for help, said they were trapped here. And someone carved 'You're next' on my door tonight." Frank's expression didn't change. Mountain folks have strange ways of communicating. Probably just local kids playing pranks. "I want to leave. Now." "Of course," Frank said, standing slowly. But you should know, once you sign the guest book, you become part of our community. Leaving isn't as simple as just walking away. Danny felt a chill run down his spine. What do you mean? Frank smiled, but it was no longer warm. The Starlight Inn has been collecting guests for over 70 years. We're like a family here. And families stick together. Danny turned to run, but the front door wouldn't budge. The handle turned, but the door remained firmly closed, as if sealed shut. He tried the windows, but they were the same, unmovable despite appearing normal. Don't fight it, Frank said calmly. It's easier if you don't fight. Danny spun around and saw that Frank was no longer alone. Other figures had emerged from the shadows, men and women of various ages, all wearing the same expression of resigned acceptance. They moved with the slow, deliberate gait of people who had long since given up hope. Welcome to the family, one of them said, her voice hollow and distant. We've been waiting for you. Danny recognized her from one of the photographs in his cabin, a woman who had supposedly stayed at the inn in the 1970s. But she looked exactly the same now, unchanged by the decades that had passed. You're all dead, Danny whispered. Not dead, Frank corrected. Collected. Preserved. We're the inn's most treasured guests, and will never check out. The figures began to close in, their movements synchronized like a well-rehearsed dance. Danny backed against the locked door, his heart pounding. The guest book lay open on the desk, and he could see now that all the signatures were identical, his own name, written over and over in the same hand. You signed the book, Frank explained. That makes you part of the collection. You'll find your cabin comfortable, and the food is excellent. Time passes differently here, but you'll adjust. Danny felt his will draining away, replaced by a strange sense of acceptance. The idea of staying didn't seem so bad anymore. The inn was peaceful, the food was good, and he had nowhere else to go anyway. That's right, Frank said, sensing his surrender. Just relax. Let it happen. Danny found himself walking back toward cabin 6, though he couldn't remember making the decision to move. The other guests followed at a respectful distance, their faces kind but empty. As he reached his door, he noticed that the message carved there had changed. Instead of, "You're next," it now read, "Welcome home." Inside the cabin, Danny sat on the bed and stared at the wall where he'd found the carved messages. They were still there, but now he understood their true meaning. They weren't cries for help, they were invitations. Welcome messages from previous guests who had found their way to the Starlight Inn. Danny picked up the small knife from the bedside table and began to carve his own message into the wall, his hand moving with practiced precision. The words formed easily, as if he'd written them 1,000 times before, "Stay with US." Outside, he could hear Frank greeting a new arrival, someone who had been caught in the storm and needed shelter for the night. Danny smiled and continued carving, preparing his cabin for the next guest. The scratching in the walls had stopped. Now Danny was the one making the sounds, welcoming each new arrival with messages of invitation and acceptance. The Starlight Inn had gained another permanent resident, another member of its ever-growing family. And in the guest book, Frank carefully wrote Danny's name again, preserving it for eternity alongside all the others who had signed their lives away on a stormy night in the mountains. The next morning brought another storm, and another lost traveler seeking shelter. The cycle continued, as it had for 70 years, each guest adding their name to the collection. The Starlight Inn welcomed them all with open arms, and none of them ever left. After all, why would they want to? They had found something better than freedom, they had found family. And family stays together forever, scratching messages in the walls for those who come after, ensuring that no one ever has to face the storm alone. The Starlight Inn always has room for one more.